Axe View here. Bernie Sanders is constantly talking about how free trade agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, have driven down wages and caused the loss of millions of jobs to America. He's saying that this has exacerbated income inequality and hurt the American middle class. Now, trade is an area where, strangely, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders agree. They both argue that free trade agreements have caused destruction to the American economy through the loss of manufacturing jobs. Now, trade is complex as we wish to pay workers a livable wage, yet we also desire the lowest prices for our products. Now, if we follow the same logic that we do for raising the U.S. minimum wage, we should argue that raising workers' wages in foreign countries will not raise prices, but instead lead to greater consumer demand. However, the difference here is that the goods produced are not typically sold in the markets where they're produced. Those foreign workers will not typically be buying expensive athletic shoes and clothing. Therefore, those increased wages will not return to the company in the form of increased revenue, and those companies do not then have an incentive to increase wages. Now, trade deals lie much within the law of comparative advantage. If a foreign country can produce a good more efficiently than my own, then that country should produce that good over mine. Since American workers generally have more skill training and education than other foreign countries' workers, it makes more sense to an economy not to use those skills on a production line that could be done by foreign workers who can work just or more efficiently. Those American workers can be using their skills and education in more advanced professions. If American companies were to employ American workers for jobs that do not require as much skill, those companies would have to pay those workers much more than they would typically, since those workers are being paid not to fully utilize their skills and education. That is why when American companies do perhaps return production to the United States, the assembly line is heavily automated so that skilled American workers do not have to be employed at a higher cost. Therefore, comparative advantage states that workers who do not have such skills and education should be doing the less skilled required work, and the skilled workers should be doing the more skilled required work. Now, this does not mean that foreign workers should be paid next to nothing for their work. They should be given humane working conditions and wages that meet their own country's cost of living. This way, foreign workers can actually have a chance at economic success rather than being used as essentially slave labor. This humane method is indeed possible and still efficient for a business, since the cost will still be lower than employing American workers. Additionally, foreign workers will then have higher workplace satisfaction and will be more productive as a result. There is indeed much room for progress here. For example, in Cambodia, a textile worker makes the equivalent of just $1,200 per year, far less than an American worker would make. These workers deserve higher wages for their work for wealthy American businesses. Upon analyzing these theories of trade, it becomes clear that trade is indeed necessary in order to ensure that all people do the work best suited for their skills. However, this does not mean that anyone should be exploited for their work. Free trade seems to work best for the world, but only when workers are treated humanely. Therefore, it seems that both Sanders and Trump are too fixated on Americans losing manufacturing jobs when in reality those workers have probably now turned to more advanced service industry jobs. Instead, American consumers can afford inexpensive goods through free trade while workers do the best jobs suited for them. If Americans lack the skills needed for the new jobs, then the government should be investing in job training programs. Even if we demand that businesses raise wages for foreign workers, they can still be raised while not becoming as costly as employing American workers would. Admittedly, prices may rise on those foreign-produced goods, yet maybe with higher wages, those foreign workers could then afford to use their wages on those same produced products, increasing revenues for the American businesses. Furthermore, when goods are cheaper, more Americans can afford those goods, which leads to greater consumer demand, hopefully leading to more job creation in the United States, such as in the service-based industry. Additionally, perhaps the service-based jobs into which those American workers transition deliver higher incomes than the former manufacturing jobs did. Therefore, American workers could possibly handle the price increase on those foreign goods. And is that not the price of conducting moral business in the world? Perhaps goods should not be so cheap from the fact that the only reason they are is because they were made through exploitative means. Based on this understanding, it seems that Trump and Sanders are fighting the wrong battle. It is not that we should be fighting the loss of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. Many economists agree that U.S. manufacturing employment is never going to return to the way that it was in past decades due to the law of comparative advantage and the inexpensiveness of automation. Even if automation becomes less expensive than employing foreign workers, at least that investment into technology will go toward another business as consumer demand, and someone must make the machines themselves and maintenance them. Therefore, it is not as though automation would simply erase all jobs forever. The U.S. instead needs to be demanding that free trade only be conducted when foreign workers are paid and treated humanely. This seems to be what President Obama aims to achieve in his signature trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Sanders and Trump oppose this deal since it does not return manufacturing jobs to the U.S., yet simply fights for higher working conditions around the world. There may be other corrupt agreements within the deal, yet the TPP seems like the correct route to go since it is becoming clearer that the prior hope of keeping manufacturing in the U.S. cannot be achieved anymore. Additionally, Trump especially mentions that large trade deficits between the U.S. and other nations are a problem that must be fixed in order to return growth to the nation. The trade deficit or surpluses are established by the balance between the total value of goods exported minus imported. Thus, the U.S. has a trade deficit since it imports more goods than exports. U.S. News reports, quote, between 2001 and 2013, the U.S. goods trade deficit with China increased by $240.1 billion. Therefore, the U.S. is importing far more goods from China than exporting it. This is true of U.S. trade overall on the global scale. Now, Trump argues that growing deficits are dragging down the economy, yet do they really matter to U.S. growth? Many economists argue that the deficits do not impact growth. For example, an economist from the Cato Institute argues, quote, the commentator's flawed critique suffers from an overly narrow view of trade. A trade deficit doesn't mean those dollars flowing abroad just disappear. They quickly return to the United States. If they are not used to buy our goods and services to export, they are used to buy American assets, treasury bills, corporate stock and bonds, real estate, and bank deposits. In this way, Americans' trade deficit is always and almost exactly offset by a foreign investment surplus. The net surplus of foreign investment into the U.S. each year keeps long-term interest rates down, prevents the crowding out of private investment by government borrowing, and promotes job creation through direct investment in U.S. factories and businesses, end quote. Therefore, maybe arguing about trade deficits is for naught, and the same economist additionally points to history to ground this claim in evidence. Quote, since 1980, real U.S. GDP has grown at an annualized rate of 3.6% during those periods of rising trade deficits, compared to a sluggish 1% during periods of shrinking deficits. So much for trade deficits being a drag on growth, end quote. Perhaps trade deficits are actually good for the U.S. economy then. It seems that both Sanders and Trump lack a well-rounded view of how free trade benefits all parties. However, our focus must be on treating workers justly around the world. This is AXView.